When I was little, we used to go camping a lot. And after the lights were all out, the fire was put out, we'd ask my dad to tell us a story. And so my choice was usually Ruth, because girls. But the one he loved to tell, because his name is Daniel, was the story of Daniel. He would tell us the story over and over again as we camped summers. And in that story, of course it changed, right? Because you never tell the same story the same way when you're doing it from your own words, right? It's always slightly different. Well, the story of Daniel is also slightly different. Daniel was a folk figure that appeared in all of these stories that people told. Throughout time and history, Daniel's story evolved and changed. And when there was trouble in the land, when the kings would come and conquer, they would tell the stories of Daniel. Tell how he and his friends were rescued from harm. Tell how he and his friends were saved. They would tell these stories over and over again. It was sort of like, you know how, if you've seen the Spider-Man movies, Spider-Man starts out one way, and then, like, all of a sudden, he's a different person in a different place. And then Spider-Man changes, right? And in the cartoon one, he goes to multiverses where there are a million Spider-Mans who have a million different stories. That's how the story of Daniel worked among the people of Israel. That it was a story that was told in a certain kind of way. It was told to tell people in the midst of empire that it's possible to resist. And empire didn't attack these stories because they were like, well, that was from long ago. So when it was in the time of the judges, they would tell the stories of Daniel about Egypt. When it was in the time of the Babylonian Empire, they would talk about the time of Judges, and Daniel would be in the stories. And each time throughout history, they would tell these stories of Daniel. The version that we have was codified during, they think, the time of the Maccabees. But y'all don't know about Maccabees except for those of you who are Catholic, because they aren't in our Bible. But during the time of the Maccabees, which is just before Jesus, when they're fighting over Roman rule, they codified the stories of Daniel, and they codified them in two ways. There is a version that was codified in Hebrew and Amharic, because it was the Jewish version of the text. And it's the text version that we have in our Bibles. So when you open it up and search for Daniel, you will find the Hebrew version of the story. But in Egypt, in the Greco-Roman world, there were stories of Daniel that floated around that weren't codified in the same way. They were kept and told, and we put those stories, which were collected together also, into what people call the Apocrypha. Because they weren't sure that they were real, they thought they might be made up. But remember, Daniel was always a story about resistance to empire, and was always changing and transforming. So even though my dad's stories may not have been the same every time he told it, he was just continuing that history of how we learn about who Daniel is and what Daniel did. And so in the story we have today, if you remember from the first week when we talked about Daniel, we have the young people, the youth, the kids, who have been kidnapped by the empire to be molded and shaped and transformed into the image of empire that they want. To speak the right language, to learn the right subjects in history, to speak in a way that made them acceptable, to learn all the subjects that made them able to be part of the government. And then in the chapter that we skipped in between, the king starts dreaming, and he starts dreaming about the downfall of empire, about how his kingdom will end and a new kingdom will come and it will fall, and on and on and on. And nobody in his court wants to tell him that his dreams are about the fall of empire. And so Daniel and his friends pray for God to give them courage, to give them the ability to speak the truth about that dream. And so Daniel tells the story of the dream. And then we get to our chapter. And one of the things in the dreams was of a big golden statue. So of course, being a king and having all the resources, you think, well, why not make what I dreamed? And so you build a huge giant statue. And then you think, wow, since I spent all that money on this huge giant statue, we should do something about that. So we will make it so that anytime the instruments play, everyone has to bow down to the golden statue. So then we have Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And they have said yes. They allowed them to change their names. They allowed them to educate them. But they got to a point where they had to say no. They had to say no because the empire was pushing them too far to go too far into a path that they couldn't travel. And so when it got to the point where they were supposed to bow down to a golden statue, they remembered their history. They remembered the statue that the people who followed Moses built, and how angry Moses became over that golden calf. And they decided that this was a step too far. And so they said no. They said no to the empire that wanted them to do something that they couldn't do. A line that they couldn't cross, a step too far for them. That wanted to give one of that last piece that they were holding on to, that their parents had taught them, that faith that they had heard before they were captured. They said no. Now, because when you're in empire, groups are always fighting with each other for power, especially groups that are of a different ethnicity. Because in order to become part of the in-group, you have to say the right words, do the right thing, make sure you're wearing the right clothes. And so this one group said, those Hebrews, they aren't doing the thing. We could get our way farther up the chain of command if we turn them in. And so they turn in Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. They turned them in, telling the king that they refused to bow down to that statue. And being a king who has little control over his emotions because nobody told him he had to, he throws a temper tantrum and decides that that means they should be brought to him, and if they refuse, he will do the worst thing he could do, the punishment that is the most awful. He would throw them into the fiery furnace. So the men are brought before the king. And at this point, how many people aren't courageous anymore? How many people say whatever needs to be said, do whatever needs to be done in order to survive? Who has the courage to say no? Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. Standing there before the king, say, I cannot bow down to something that I know my God is not present in that form. I know my God is not that. And so the king gets even madder because kings have this uncontrollable emotion because nobody ever stops them. He decides not just any fire, we're going to make that fire as hot as we possibly can. And so they throw the 3 men into the furnace. And that's where our 2 scriptures come in. The first is called the prayer of Azariah, in which he says, God, you are everything. Forgive me for anything. And then they start singing. They remember their history, they remember their God, and they start singing praise. They start singing about all the blessings they have experienced under God. They share all of creation history, sharing how wonderful God is, who blessed and created everything from the stars in the sky to the people in front of them. They sing and pray. And in that moment, those who are outside watching in see someone's around them and protect them. But they're singing the songs that they know from their history. They're singing of the story that they have heard before. They're bringing to empire what is excluded. Did we have the courage to say no? As I was thinking about that, I thought about this image, which appears over and over again. If you've ever seen it, there's this man over in the corner in this big crowd of people who are all hailing Hitler, and he's like this. And on Facebook, whenever you see this ad, it says, be like him. Now, there's arguments over who this man could be. Some say he's this dock worker who was married to a Jewish woman, although people didn't recognize the relationship. And he could not say Hail Hitler to the people who were trying to destroy his wife and his family. Others argue it was a religious man who, because of his faith, could not say no, could not do what empire needed him to do. But imagine that image. That's our 3 men, right? That is Azariah, Hananiah, and Mishael. They are the ones who are standing there refusing to do what empire tells them to do. I was trying to raise other stories. I figured this one works for you guys because you're all 49ers fans or whatever. I don't know football. But I know Colin Kaepernick because in the midst of the BML riots, he said, we have to do something to say that this is wrong. And so he actually had just been sitting, and nobody noticed when he was just sitting. But a soldier had noticed and spoke to him and talked to him and said, I think it would be more appropriate for you to take a knee during the singing of the national anthem. And that knee cost him his job. That knee made him a symbol in a way that none of the other activity had done. He could speak all he wanted, but it wasn't until he took a knee that people heard that it was wrong for police violence, that the state should not be used to harm people because of the color of their skin. The second image, sorry, I have to look up her name, is one that was actually repeated during the BML riots, and it has been repeated again and again whenever faced with soldiers. It is an American young girl named Jan Rose Casimir. She confronts the National Guard in 1967. This is the big march on Washington against the war. And this image went viral in the way it could back then, not the way it would now, of her standing with a flower in front of the soldiers, saying no to war. That march, that event, helped begin turning the tide of what people thought about the Vietnam War. She said no when other people were saying yes. These stories of Daniel and his friends are meant to encourage us, knowing that the answer isn't always safety and winning. Sometimes the answer, like in my first image, is if he is the one person, because he is married to a Jewish woman, she is sent to the gas chambers and dies. The kids survive in foster homes. He gets drafted by the army and just disappears. So they assume he died on the battlefield. But before they voluntold him into the army, they also imprisoned him for not following the rules. Our story, the person we follow, Jesus, also said no to empire. Maybe he was like my dad, his father, or Mary, told him the stories of Daniel, of saying no to empire, of praying in the hardest circumstances you face, of standing up when it is easier to stand down, of retaining your identity and belief in a God of love and hope and grace and mercy, a God of compassion. And Jesus took those stories of his faith tradition that taught him that God is the one we should follow, not the empire. That God is the one who promises those who are left out, left behind the last, promise them a place in the kingdom, promises them that no matter what life looks like, you are welcome in the family of God. And that belief in a God of love. Because if you read the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus tells us what we are to live like, when asked, what is the greatest thing you can know and do? He says the whole thing. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. He took that seriously. And it led him to confront power again and again and again until his no led to his death on the cross. And sometimes our no puts us in danger. But our scriptures teach us that that's what we're called to do. To say no to these systems of power that are harming people. To say no when we see ICE agents in mass grabbing people off the street because they sell bagels but don't have the right paper. Because they spoke out and said the war in Israel is wrong. We're invited to say no. Say no when we see people saying that trans kids don't deserve health care, even though they were created in the image of God, blessed as they are, and we have the means of making them whole. We're invited to say no to empire that says these people, less than 1% of the population, deserve to be treated worse than anyone else on the planet. We're invited to say no when we come across that. So this week, as the forces of war gather, as they try to convince you that we should just be randomly dropping bombs, remember the story of Daniel. Daniel said no. Daniel and these men said no when the world was saying, yay, go for it. Daniel said no to a state that was wrong, to a king that was mad. And we tell this story over and over and over again to remind ourselves that this God that blessed the entire world is with us and will be with us even when our no requires bravery and courage and facing down the powers of evil. Amen.